Hello. Let's see if I can get this started. First, I want to thank you all hugely for inviting me to this conference. It's a huge honor. I don't often give talks about my work or about nature, and so I'm really, to use an English term, chuffed to be here, to be in Mérida, which is a beautiful city. Let's see, let's wait for this to go. For those of you who are streaming, and I've saved the best for last, so no problems there. I've titled my talk Covering Science at Nature because I am a journalist. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a manuscript editor. I'm a journalist, and I cover science for Nature. And as most of you probably know, Nature is one of the two, I guess, leading science journals in the world. I pulled this cartoon up that kind of compares Nature to our competitor Science, and we're pretty similar. We both publish some of the top research in the world. We cost about the same, have similar impact factors, and they both support pretty large news operations that allow journalists like me to cover science for working scientists. Just to get all the obvious questions out of the way, just run by the stats. Nature employs about 25 journalists in the U.S. We have offices in Washington, D.C., New York, Boston, San Francisco, in UK, in London, where I'm based, in Paris, in Munich, Germany, in Tokyo, and soon in China. And we have freelancers all over the world. I think this is one of the things that really, stands Nature out from our competitor, is that we really try to cover science globally. So we have people writing for us in Australia, South Africa, Kenya, here in Mexico, Brazil, Canada, Spain, China, more. And if we're always looking for more people to write for us from around the world to bring science news. So if you're interested, just get in touch with me at that email address. I'll broadcast it later. We'd love to consider more stories from Latin America, especially. Each week, we produce about 30 print pages of news and opinion each week, which is quite an endeavor. I'm not sure how it comes out, but it does. And alongside that, we produce several news stories that appear only online on our website, nature.com/news. We have 3 podcasts, one a weekly Nature podcast that I work on, 2 monthly podcasts, one focused on neuroscience, and one that we've just started this year on the history of science, which I really encourage you to check out. It's just really well done, compelling audio. And lots of tweets from Nature News, and our companion site, Heard at Nature, just mentions the goings-on in our office. And we produce regular videos on research and to accompany news stories, and I'll show you some of those. Our business model is something I'll get to later, but we're largely supported by individual and institutional subscriptions. And what I mean by institutional subscriptions is that pretty much every university in the world has a subscription to Nature, an electronic subscription, so their researchers can download it, and that's what largely pays my job. As many of you know, this model is changing as science moves to open access. I'll talk about that in a bit, but that's where most of our support comes from. We have probably maybe about 50,000 people, individual scientists and non-scientists, but mostly scientists, who take out subscriptions to Nature and receive the glossy magazine each week. But most of our funding comes from universities, from the public, so we're quite thankful for that. We do some sponsored content, we have special projects, and we have a few regional sites that help pay the bills, such as Nature Middle East. I'm happy to answer more questions about this later, but I'll get on to more interesting things. So Nature, we're not as old as Scientific American. Nature was started in November 4th, 1869. And I just wanted to read you our I think we call it a mission statement, which was included in that first issue, and it stands today. We opened with a quote from the poet William Wordsworth: "To the solid ground of nature, trust the mind which builds for aye." And then we wrote, The objective, which it is proposed to attain by this periodical, may be broadly stated as follows: is intended first to place before the general public the grand results of scientific work and scientific discovery, and to urge the claims of science to move to a more general recognition in education and in daily life. So we always, saw science for its influence on the public. So public outreach has always been important in nature. And secondly, I quote here now, to aid scientific men and women now, of course, themselves by giving early information of all advances made in any branch of natural knowledge throughout the world, and by affording them an opportunity of discussing the various scientific questions which arise from time to time. With that goal in mind, Nature instantly started covering news. They were it was quirky. We covered things like Muybridge's effort to determine the answer to the long-held question: does a horse is it ever completely in air when it's running? And the answer was yes. We covered the eruption of Krakatoa. In August 1883, we published this dispatch: we give this week a further installment of notices of the strange colored effects of recently observed in the skies, and our readers in all parts of the world will render a service if they will communicate any similar facts. Less importantly, we published letters from our readers on topics such as the ingenuity of a pigeon, a carnivorous goose, and we included anagrams and amusing experiments like this contraption, which I still haven't figured out what it does. One of our early editors, Nature editors, a man named Richard Gregory, who served in the 1920s, he did really see Nature as a news service, and he was really, concerned about how science was communicated in mainstream journalism. So he basically saw Nature as a news service that would communicate to the lay public what was going on in science. This continued to, until the 1960s, when a very important editor named John Maddox, who just died a couple years ago, who's a titan, he came from a news background. He worked for the Manchester Guardian, which has become The Guardian, and he wanted to make Nature even newsier. He wanted to make it a daily operation that was responding to what was going on in science. He also made the very important step of introducing formal peer review to the journal article section of Nature. It may surprise you, especially the scientists in the room, that Nature didn't formally peer review papers until the 1960s. Before that, the science editors were very well connected, and they would get a letter from their chum at Cambridge, Francis Crick, James Watson, for instance, and they'd get the manuscript and they'd just publish it. We'd have, apparently there were thousands of manuscripts just sitting on windowsills stacked up. So what John Maddox did, in addition to instituting kind of a spirit of journalism, was he kind of instituted this formal peer review system to have professional editors who said yay or nay, more often nay, unfortunately. And he also expanded Nature's reach. We opened an office in Washington, D.C., which was headed by a journalist named Nicholas Wade, who now works at the New York Times with Pam, who I'm not sure if she's still here, but he got his beginnings at Nature. We went global. We opened offices in San Francisco, Boston, New Delhi, Paris. We started a column in the Times of London, which we'd done, I think, in the 19th century. It was started by a gentleman named Henry G. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with. He's now known as Nature's Fur and Feathers editor. He edits paleontology and stuff like that. We have a website, of course, launched very late in 2004, but it made an impact. It won the Association for British Science Writers Award for the best science writing on the World Wide Web. Nature continues to do very well in that competition. So what we do today, I think sometime in the last 5 years, we made a very strategic decision, and it coincided with the acquisition of Scientific American by our parent company, Macmillan. We decided that we're going to write about science for scientists. So news stories, I'm quoting the vision of our former editor, who's left for science. News stories should speak to nature's core, scientists and people closely connected with science and community, along with the occasional story about research that has a high fascination quotient, or a connection to broader social concerns. We cover politics, business, technology, medicine, personalities, but it's always got to be for a scientist. So that was a decision we made. Prior to that, a lot of our news coverage was very much focused on writing about science for a general audience, covering research, simply because it was interesting. And we still do that, but I think we made the decision that if we're going to survive and be essential, we need to become a must-read for the scientists, for working scientists. And I'll show you some of the stories that have come out of this change. This first story, it's not one I wrote. This was written by a colleague of mine named Lee Phillips, who's a Canadian freelancer. And I think it epitomizes an investigation. And we don't run a lot of these, but we hope, when we do that, they reveal bigger issues important to scientists, such as animal research, or here in Mexico, I'm talking about my colleague's story, the rise of eco-anarchists who target nanotechnology labs and scientists. So my colleague Lee, having written about this issue in the past, came to Mexico and made an effort to at least make contact with these groups who have been threatening and in some cases bombing laboratories here in Mexico, which I think it's obviously a very important issue here in Mexico, and it's something that most of our scientific readers weren't aware of, but instantly spoke to them. In Britain, there are a lot of researchers have been targeted by animal rights activists. So I think it was a story that hit home for our readers. Another great example of investigation that another colleague of mine, Alison Abbott, did in the last couple of years is she's been doggedly pursuing plagiarism accusations in Eastern Europe, among Eastern European scientists and science ministers. In Romania especially, where she exposed plagiarism in academic research of their science minister that led to his resignation and nearly toppled Romania's government. So, and it's become a problem, not a problem, it's become an issue, especially all over Europe, even in Germany, where plagiarism in part of government ministers has been exposed that they copied their doctoral thesis or something like that. We don't do a lot of stories like this, but just giving you an example to show the import that some of our coverage can have. I'm going to show you now an investigation from our competitor, from Science. I'm sure maybe some of you heard about this open access sting that the Science reporter John Bohannon did. It was really clever, really heroic. What he did was he created a series of hundreds of fake papers that were fatally flawed, and then he sent them to so-called open access journals. These are journals where instead of an individual or a library subscribing, researchers pay to have their work published, and it's completely available to the public or anyone who wants to read. The problem is that some of these journals and some other journals are basically frauds. They'll accept any research, and they're just raking in money. So this reporter sent out hundreds of papers. A lot of them got accepted, and he wrote about it. This really important article. The problem was there was a bit of blowback because when the article was promoted, they argued that it exposed the flaws of open access. The problem was, his critics pointed out, is that he didn't send papers out to subscription journals. He didn't have a control experiment. So while this very influential story, it led the news agenda for days and days and days. It's great. led to quite a harsh backlash. And I think that's something we at Nature are aware of, that if we are going to drive the agenda, we are going to get pushback. And we've got to be able to defend our stories. Other things that I think are really important for us is just when science is in the news. The U.S. government shutdown is thankfully averted. My government saw some sense. And, you know, here we're basically taking what's happening in politics and looking for the research angle. I don't know if any of you saw the coverage, but I think, you know, we and a lot of others, you know, looked at some of the impacts to scientists. For instance, lab animals at the National Institutes of Health, which is the big biomedical center in Washington, D.C. Lab animals, they were only, you know, maintained. Years of experiments were lost because of the shutdown. An Antarctic research season was nearly lost because of this. I mean, these are stories about, you know, about politics, but they're about how politics is influencing the lives of researchers, and that's something that, you know, that we felt was very important. Science funding, obviously very important. I've never met a scientist who doesn't need funding or who doesn't think we should get more funding. And then, you know, a category of story that I'm a bit wary of is taking a news event and digging for a scientific angle when one is not there, or there are clearly more important things to cover. The humanitarian crisis in Syria, for instance. I think we as a magazine made a decision not to write anything, you know, for quite some time in that situation. Same with the Arab Spring. These aren't scientific issues at heart. Community stories. These are stories that I think, you know, when I explain them to, if I explain some of these stories to someone who's not a scientist, their eyes will glaze over. I talking about them with scientists, and these are the stories they get most excited about. I'm talking about things like publishing, funding, things like this. My colleague, Richard Van Noorden, did this fabulous feature a couple years ago called The Trouble with Retractions, which looked at the rise in retractions, either for honest error or for misconduct that we've seen really in the last years, and tried to analyze what was causing it. Was it the fact that just more people were paying attention than there have always been? There's always been misconduct in research. Was it the fact that funding has, you know, dried up to the point where researchers are fudging their results? Some researchers are fudging their results. So stories like that, I think, you know, are really the kinds of things that we hope that people come to Nature for. But, you know, we're aware that there are lots of specialist blogs and trade publications covering these areas, and so I think we weigh very carefully, or we're very careful about when we weigh in. You know, we think, you know, these specialist sources do a great job of covering kind of the daily beat, and when we step in to write about retractions or open access publishing, we want our story to be important, so we pick our times well. And I think as evidence that these stories are important, we often see them cited in research papers by scientists. Stories that are a bit more like what we used to be doing, and a bit more like general science journalism, is trend stories. And I show you an example of one I did a couple years ago. The headline is "Studies Slow the Human DNA Clock," and it's got a pretty picture of a skeleton, but it's about a really arcane topic, and that's the molecular clock, which is the rate at which DNA mutates that's used to kind of trace events in human evolution. And some studies sequencing the genomes of families, so parents, children, and their grandparents, has suggested that it's ticking a little bit slower, this molecular clock. And so what I did, instead of writing about each individual paper, you know, trying to come up with, you know, how fast or slow this clock is beating, I kind of took a step back and waited about 2 years, or about a year and a half, to write this story, and combined several papers, and I think as a result, you know, had a much stronger story. It was one our competitors at Science followed up about a month or 2 months later. So there's obviously something in the air, and I think these trend stories are a really good opportunity to write about really arcane, tricky topics that one finding alone just, it just leaves you baffled. It doesn't answer questions. So if you just wait, you can maybe find where the field is going. And I think these stories are really, I think they're more satisfying for scientists as readers, because they're more honest about how science is done. They don't pretend that discoveries come out of nowhere. They recognize the halting, slow pace of research, and realizing that researchers, as Newton says, are standing on the shoulders of giants. So I really love doing these stories, and I'm always looking for trends. I realize I'm a little bit behind you on that one. Sorry. Does anybody know who this woman is? I'm going to start talking about some stories that I've done that I'm particularly proud of. Yeah? Yeah. This is Henrietta Lacks. For those of you who is anybody not familiar with the story of Henrietta Lacks? All right, I'll go through it. It's a really fascinating story. Henrietta Lacks, she was a working-class African-American woman who lived in Baltimore, Maryland. She died in 1951, sadly, of a cervical tumor. However, a biopsy of her tumor collected right before, a few months before she died, without her knowledge or consent, which was kind of how research was done at the time. It became the first human cell line, and really the first cell line to grow well in the laboratory. That is, to keep dividing and dividing and dividing. Before that, cells would just kind of kick out after a few days or weeks or even months. Henrietta's didn't. Their cells were named HeLa, and they've contributed to a mind-boggling amount of research. It's something like 85,000 papers in Medline, which have used this cell line. But her family only learned about this cell line more than 2 decades actually, after her death. And they had no say in how the cells were used, which you could say, fair enough. They were collected according to the ethics of the time, which stated that you didn't need to ask permission. And this is a story that was told amazingly in Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. I urge you all to read it. It'll change how you think about research. There's a movie that Oprah is producing that should be out in the next couple of years, so you can wait for that, or you can read the book. So beginning with this in mind, I'd say about in March of this year, I got sent a press release from a colleague of mine, and the headline was HeLa genome sequenced. And he's like, we got to get on this. This is huge. And I'm skeptical of every press release I get. I urge that everyone to be that way. And I thought, there's no way the HeLa genome hadn't been sequenced before. It's such a common cell line. Genomics has been really easy and cheap for some years now. Somebody has to have done it. Turns out they hadn't, or they hadn't published it. And so I covered this. It was a research paper in kind of an obscure journal. And my story, which I wouldn't say I'm embarrassed about, but my story basically wrote about this from a researcher's perspective, that here is the genome of this really important cell line. We know it came from this woman, Henrietta Lacks. We can say some things about the genome, which came from her tumor. We can guess maybe what mutations drove her tumor, things like that. I didn't think that this would be a sensitive topic. It didn't occur to me, I think, like a lot of researchers. But it was. About a week after my story came out and other people started covering this, Rebecca Skloot wrote an editorial in the New York Times. Basically, she had spoken with members of the Lacks family whom she was in touch with, and they weren't happy. They felt like their privacy had been violated. And it was just something that I and the researchers who did this work didn't think about. So the researchers, to their credit, they pulled the genome from public databases, and they were just looking for a solution. And so that's when I wrote a second story about a week later. I'm not sure if you can see this debate. It's just talking about all the bioethical issues that people that had been raised by this. I pointed out that it's actually in a lot of cases. researchers still don't need to ask permission to use discarded samples of people's tumors, so long as the patient isn't identified. The problem here is that Henrietta and her family are forever identified. You can't take that away. I looked into this idea that should the family have some say in how their mother and their grandmother's genome is used? Should they have been able to veto it? And that opens up a really tough issue, because perhaps you could use that to say that your children or your parents or your cousins could prevent you from donating your genome to research, which is something that most researchers and probably most of the public would disagree with. So it opened up this can of worms. And then things kind of went silent. That was it. And I just kept kind of following the story, checking in with the researchers whose paper had been held. And I got an email this summer saying they've been negotiating with the Lax family. The National Institutes of Health, which is the major biomedical funder in the U.S., its director, Francis Collins, had been meeting several times with the family of Henrietta Lacks, basically trying to see if they can work something out. It had emerged also from my reporting that another paper describing the HeLa genome was about to be published when this whole broke. It was about to be published in my journal Nature, which I learned independently. So a lot of things were riding in the balance. And so I learned that the NIH had come to an agreement with the Lax family that they were going to endorse the re-release of their grandmother's genome, subject to some restrictions that said researchers had to apply for permission to use it, and they had to credit the Lax family. And by following this story, most reporters didn't know about this until I think maybe the day before. I followed it closely and kept asking, was able to leverage enough pressure to go out to Washington, D.C., to interview Francis Collins, to interview members of the Lax family. I think I was able to write a much fuller, nicer account of these issues. And I also ran a Q&A with Francis Collins based on our hour-long interview. Which brings me to something that I've learned in this story, is that covering science at a science journal can be tricky. As I referred to, Nature had accepted one of the HeLa papers, and I independently learned about this. I reported it, so I made it public, which made life quite difficult for editors at Nature, for the people who accept papers. And also learned about the negotiations, which also made life quite hard for them, and used this to leverage access. It's something that we run into from time to time, where our news stories cause problems for the journal, particularly stories that involve misconduct. We find out that a paper at Nature is potentially fraudulent. If we, for other reasons, write about Nature papers, or when we cover open access publishing, which kind of gets into Nature's funding model. But we have this policy at Nature, we call it a Chinese wall, that essentially treats me as a Nature reporter just like any other reporter. So this gives me the freedom to treat Nature like any other source and cover them objectively. It's hugely important. I completely value it. And, there are downsides. We could have a better working relationship with the journal and, do big flashes on big papers. And I think it's more important for us to have our objectivity. Another story that I did recently that I think is a really interesting one for this audience is I profiled this woman whose name is Fiona Fox. She's a very important woman in science and science journalism in the UK. She runs an organization called the Science Media Centre. She started the Science Media Centre, and it's basically it's a nonprofit that works with researchers to promote. It works with researchers to promote the communication of really hot-button topics in the UK press. It was established about a decade ago after perceived miscommunication about GM crops, mad cow disease, and other issues. They basically wanted to get scientific voices in the public. And they're hugely in news coverage where they've been left out before. It's hugely important. Scarcely a science story reaches British daily papers without having the influence of the Science Media Center. And we at Nature were just fascinated by this. I know I get their emails and briefings and things. So we decided that we would profile Fiona Fox, who's this very dynamic, very energetic, very controversial woman. And to do this, I decided I would spend a lot of time with her. So I traveled with her she was headed to a laboratory in the north of England where she was giving a talk to researchers at this government laboratory that does research on pesticides, GM, all these hot button issues that scientists don't really want to talk about because they've gotten burned by the press. And she was there telling the researchers, you've got to talk to the press. If you don't, people opposed to GM crops, people opposed to pesticides, et cetera, they're the ones who are going to fill the gap. And so she was really making a plea. And so I opened my story with this line. Well, reporters know that the top line of the story is probably the bit we work the longest on, the bit we see as the most important. And I wrote, depending on whom you ask, Fiona Fox is either saving science journalism or destroying it. Today she is touting its benefits to a room full of reluctant scientists. Your voice has to be heard. The charismatic and sometimes combative head of Britain's Science Media Center tells an audience of more than 70. I say destroying science journalism. That wasn't my opinion, but she's a very polarizing figure. A lot of people think that she and her organization are basically promoting science by press release, reducing debates, et cetera, et cetera. And that's quite a common view amongst journalists. But scientists love her. They think the world of her, and you can see a dramatic shift in how science is communicated in the British public because of this woman. And I mention this now just because the model is spreading around the world. There's science media centers in Australia, Canada. One is going to start soon in the U.S., Germany, and I wouldn't be surprised if somebody sooner or later is thinking about starting one in Mexico. Where it's something. It's very interesting. They'll all run separately. It was an utterly fascinating topic to report on. Another story that I am quite proud of that I did recently was I profiled the Polio Eradication Initiative, which is the global effort to eradicate polio. It's the largest public health effort. It's cost more than $10 billion. It's lasted 25 years. It's missed lots of deadlines. But rather than do this, big story looking at this mega project and talk to people at WHO, et cetera, I thought, I wanted to find a separate story in it. And because I'm writing for Nature, I wanted to profile researchers. So what I did was I heard about this program that the U.S. government's Centers for Disease Control had just started in northern Nigeria, which is one of the 3 countries that has never been able to wipe out polio, and it's probably one of the most problematic. Where they've been targeting, or they've been trying to reach nomadic peoples who aren't living in cities, who move about. Their idea, thinking, is that these populations are spreading the virus throughout the country, and so they basically, just started fanning out, censusing these populations. And I asked, could I join them? Northern Nigeria is quite a dangerous place. Some polio workers were murdered there a couple months after I visited. So it was quite difficult getting out there, but I did, and wrote quite a big story. But what I want to bring attention to is, and I made a small video. Hopefully this will show. And just to emphasize the point is that, not a lot of Western reporters get to go to these parts of northern Nigeria, and I had no filmmaking experience. All I had was a little digital camera, like one you take pictures with, and I just kind of, sat on the backs of motorcycles and, took lots of video, and then worked with a very talented video journalist on my team named Noah Baker, and we basically came up with a video story that told it, and I'll play it for you. It's quite short. I think it encapsulates the story quite well. Children every year. A global eradication campaign begun in 1988 has reduced that figure to hundreds, and the virus now circulates in only 3 countries: Pakistan, Afghanistan, and here in Nigeria. To stamp out the polio virus for good, these countries mount nationwide immunization campaigns on a near monthly basis. Locally trained health workers, identified by their blue aprons, fan out to cities, towns, and villages, giving simple oral vaccines to as many young children as they can find. Despite these efforts, some children are never reached by the vaccination teams. In hard-to-reach patches of northern Nigeria, the children of nomadic cattle and sheep herders are particularly susceptible to polio. What's more, their migrations may spread the virus around Nigeria and beyond, preventing polio from being wiped out. I'm nature reporter Ewen Callaway, and I traveled to Nigeria to search for nomadic communities with a team of epidemiologists. The nomads belong to a cultural group called the Fulani, and twice a year they trek cross-country. In December, when I visited, some nomadic families had already begun their migration south in search of greener pastures for their animals. The epidemiologists I was with used satellite imaging to get an idea where the nomads live, but reaching these settlements is another matter. Off-road motorbikes were a must. The team works with local guides, but they don't always know where exactly to find the nomadic settlements, so we sometimes had to stop and ask for directions. Each family has their own ruga, a collection of mud brick huts, and their relatives often live in neighboring settlements a few hundred meters away. The team arrived with a local Fulani leader. He introduced us to the head of the household and told him we were trying to eradicate polio among nomads. The team is working on building a map of every nomadic settlement they find. They also record the number of young children in the settlement and whether or not they have been vaccinated before. Mohammed Abu Bakar, a Fulani nomad, told us that he could not remember anyone ever coming to his ruga to vaccinate his children. In the past year, epidemiologists have mapped more than 30,000 settlements and identified over 700,000 young children living in nomadic and other remote communities here. The goal is that nomadic communities will be included in national polio immunization campaigns and that children like Abu Bakar's will be vaccinated routinely. The global polio eradication effort has lasted 25 years and cost over $10 billion, becoming one of the costliest and longest-running public health efforts in history. If polio is to become a thing of the past, then countries like Nigeria will have to stamp out the virus from its final hideouts, no matter how difficult they are to find. Great. So that's, just an example of, with, a handheld camera. It made me a little sick watching those motorcycle shots. Captured about an hour of those trying to hold it still. But it's a good example of what you can do with a relatively cheap camera, getting access to places that other people don't. That's one of the great things about being a journalist is, we get to see things that others don't. And it's great to be able to show them that. And just having, a talented colleague to work with you. I want to show you one other video. It's not one I did, but I think it's one that really encapsulates Nature's new focus, is writing about science for scientists. And this story, it's got a great headline, End of an Age for Aquarius. And Aquarius is an undersea laboratory, I think off the coast of Florida, that was slated for closure. And a regular freelancer of ours named Mark Schroep, who has the very enviable beat of covering the oceans. He lives on the beach, I believe. He did a great story, but he got to go actually in this laboratory. And so I want to show you a little bit of this video. And the audio is awful, but that's actually because they were underwater, under pressure, and it wreaks havoc with microphones. So I'll just show you a bit of this one, just so you can see. And I think this is great because it's a story about research funding, but it's underwater.
is Aquarius, the world's only operating undersea laboratory. Scientists can live down here for up to 2 weeks, giving them as much to dive to the lab. I could be one of the last visitors because, with budget struggles ahead, the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which owns the lab, is recommending that Congress cut its funding. I'm going to meet the researchers who think Aquarius is worth saving. Here I go.
I'll stop it there because the audio gets really bad. But I really love this story because, it's got sea turtles and funding for one, which are two things I think you can't go wrong with at nature. But it's the way it was done, and this is all in the production, it was an adventure. I'm a reporter. I'm going to take you somewhere to this underwater laboratory, and I'm pretty sure what Mark did was just he captured copious amounts of footage with probably a cheap camera, and one of those things that lets you use it underwater, and then just worked with one of our video editors to assemble a story. And I think that's something that I would urge you all to do. It doesn't take a lot of effort to actually assemble these stories with software tools available now, and for not a lot of money, you can make a great story if you have access to some place that nobody else does. Nearing the end of my talk, and I want to get to one point, which is, I guess I've kind of emphasized, is that nature, some years ago, we consciously made a decision that we were going to cover science, and cover it hard, writing for scientists. And this is where I kind of draw a distinction sometimes between science journalism and science communication. Both very important, but I think they have very different goals. So I think science communication, I see it about is sharing how amazing science is, how amazing scientific discovery is. It's really important. I have lots of friends and colleagues who work in SciComms, and they're doing brilliant work. And I agree that science is awesome. I love it. I'm a former scientist. I love covering it. But at Nature, we believe that scientists, funders, and others, including publishers like Nature, they need to be held accountable to the public. And I think that's really we see that as our duty for issues with funding. I've never met a scientist, I just said this earlier, I've never met a scientist who didn't ask for more funding. And we have to ask the question, is more funding better? Are we funding the right things? I think these are important questions that journalists should be asking scientists. Fraud and misconduct. It's not very nice when people cheat, but they do, and they need to be held accountable. And I think it's our job as journalists to ask these tough questions. And I urge you all to do that. Government regulation. There was, I'm thinking, stem cell work, for instance, in the U.S. has been a hugely fraught issue. And I think it's offered many opportunities for journalists to ask, are these government regulations, do they make sense? Publishing, another hot button issue. I think our coverage on open access is not at all influenced by the fact that I'm paid by the opposite model. So I think that gives us to ask tough questions of our bosses, really. And even scientific research. Just because something is published in Nature or Science doesn't mean it's not infallible, and doesn't mean it's even right. Humans make errors. Peer reviewers, miss things, and I think it's our job as scientists to ask tough questions, to send papers out to other people, and if they say things that that make sense, that they bring up shortcomings, well, put that in your story. Or if you find people criticizing other people's research, put that in your story, as long as the criticism is about the research and not personal. The personal stuff, that's interesting, but I think we don't want to become the Daily Mail of science. So this tension at Nature continues between promoting science or talking about how great science is and this kind of hard-nosed model. And we still do really fun discovery stories, and I think it's really epitomized by this one my colleague Daniel did about a year ago, and the headline says it all. Can you see it? It says, "Buddhist Iron Man found by Nazis is from space." Yeah, it's got everything: space, Nazis, Eastern religion. And it's basically about this artifact that was allegedly made from a meteorite, and that the Nazis confiscated. It generated like 1 million page views. It's one of our most read stories ever. And I contrast that with this paper, "Brazilian Citation Scheme Outed." And this is another great story that actually got quite a few 100,000 views, or a couple 100,000 views, from my colleague Richard Van Noorden. And he uncovered this, they called it a citation cartel, which is not to be confused with the cartels here, where these Brazilian researchers, or editors of journals, were citing each other's journals in an effort to raise their impact factor. And the organization that covers that allots impact factors, which is the measurement of how influential a journal is, had basically banned them because they've uncovered this practice. So my colleague very carefully got in touch with these researchers who complained that the only reason they did this was because their government, judged them on impact factor, and so this was the only way for them to get government funding. Really great story. It would bore a non-scientist to death, I think, maybe, but it was one that was really popular for our readers, and I think they're the people we keep in mind. We'll still do fun stories about the Buddhist Iron Mans found by the Nazis being from space, but stories like this are really what I think nature is about and what nature is for. I've just got one more thing. I think just one more thing to add. I too get email from readers, and I don't know if anybody knows who this is. This is a Chinese swimmer named Yi Shiwen, who won the gold medal in the women's 200 individual medley at the London Olympics last year. And there was quite a bit. She broke the world record, and she did it in such a manner that a lot of swimming commentators and newspapers were saying she's going so fast, she must have been doping. It was quite a controversy. And I've covered sports doping a fair bit. And so I wrote what I thought was a very sober story, not even about this, but looking at this idea as how fast is too fast? Can you use somebody's performance to not prove that they're doping, but to say that this is an outlier, this performance is a statistical outlier, and therefore you should follow them more closely. Which I thought was a very, even-handed, sober story, right up nature's alley. Talked about research in this area, spoke with researchers, and just used this news angle just to write about something I found interesting. Just only did it online, and the internet exploded. I'll read for you some of the mail I received, or one letter I received. We upset a lot of researchers, and I apologize for my language I'm about to use in a second. I have the dubious distinction of fitting more obscenities into stories in quotations than any other researchers. So, Mr. Ewen, are you stupid? Is this your job? Why are you published such damn article? Oh my God, what happened? Nature, an amazing journal, but you, a hot shit, a big shit. Such article can be published on Nature? My dear Nature, I have an article about shit Ewen. Can you accept it? I consider Nature as one of the top science journals in this world, but from now you lose my respect. Keep in mind. And it goes on like that. I received about 1,000 of these, which was quite disheartening, and I was able to brush it off, but it just reminded me, that in all seriousness, I stand up to my story, and my editor stood up to the story, that I have a duty. I'm writing for Nature. You know, it is a leading scientific journal. People take it very seriously, and I don't want to squander that duty. Anyway, I've gone way too long. I'll happy to take some questions now. If we don't have time, I'll answer questions over beers later. I'm here for 2 more days, so come find me. Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here.